Hello, this is Dr. Martell, and in this lecture I'll be providing some background on our next philosopher, William James, and then getting into the content of those first two lectures that he gave on pragmatism. So, first to the background. William James lived from 1842 to 1910. He's an American philosopher and also a very prominent figure in the history of psychology. Psychology, as with a number of other now separate scientific disciplines, emerged out of the discipline of philosophy. What we call the natural sciences, especially physics, had done this several centuries before the 19th century. Psychology, right, emerged as its own separate scientific discipline towards the end of the 19th century. A number of figures within philosophy actually were instrumental in this process, and one of the most prominent of these figures, certainly in the United States, is William James. And indeed, I believe that James is the person responsible for setting up the first, essentially a psychological laboratory in the United States, so that the science of psychology would have a properly experimental basis. William James is also someone who came from a very prominent family. His brother is someone of equal renown within the literary arts. That's Henry James, the great American 19th century, principally novelist. William James is one of the foremost representatives, too, of a philosophical movement, homegrown American philosophical movement, called Pragmatism. He is not the only pragmatist, and he cannot even claim to be like the founder of pragmatism. He could have claimed it at best like a founding role shared with others, especially a man to whom he refers in these lectures, Charles Sanders Peirce, another American philosopher of the same generation as James. They actually knew each other and were friends for a time, but not for long. Still, other philosophers who are known as pragmatists are arguably just as important to this movement as James and Peirce, right? Another very prominent pragmatist philosopher is John Dewey, who largely was interested in applying ideas that all the pragmatists shared to political issues and also to the issue of education and how it is sort of best conducted. I think George Herbert Mead is another very prominent figure in pragmatism who mostly was interested in applying ideas, again, that pragmatists tend to share to problems in sociology and I believe also like communication studies. So you'll run across pragmatists if you pursue many different academic disciplines: psychology, philosophy, political science, education, sociology, communication studies. And it should also be noted that this is a living philosophical movement. There are still pragmatists, there are still philosophers to this day in the United States and elsewhere around the world who identify as pragmatists, or following the footsteps of people like James and Dewey and Peirce. And so this makes pragmatism unlike the philosophies that we've dealt with so far. There are Plato scholars certainly today, many of them, and there are certainly people who remain sympathetic to many of Plato's views, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any living philosopher who would identify as a Platonist, like believing in the theory of forms and all of that. Same goes for Augustinians. Certainly you can find people who belong to religious orders who accept many of Augustine's views concerning that faith, right? But you'd be hard pressed to find any living philosopher who accepts Augustine's metaphysical views, including like that great chain of being view that he had, right? In which reality comes in like many different levels with God at the top, right? Almost no one these days would identify as a Cartesian, in spite of the fact that they share many of the actually more problematic beliefs of Descartes. But there are people who do identify as pragmatists. Okay. So these lectures on pragmatism that James gives, they were given to what I'm going to call like a lay audience, relatively late in his life. So he designed the lectures so as to be intelligible to the educated general public, right? So he's not speaking to like just fellow philosophers or scientists of one kind or another, and so he's succinct. He's admirably clear in explaining to his audience both what pragmatism is and like why they should care, And as a pretty good speaker, it seems, public speaker, James began in these lectures with explaining to his audience like why they should care, like why pragmatism like should matter to them. And his explanation has to do with what I'm going to describe as a cultural crisis of the late 19th century and early 20th century, a crisis that is, I suppose, still with us to some extent. And I'm going to describe this crisis in terms different than the terms that James chose to use. He talks about a conflict between temperaments, right? The tough-minded and the tender-minded. We'll get to that. But I think it is more helpful for us now to describe the conflict in different terms, and I'm gonna describe it as a conflict between basically like religiously minded people on the one hand and scientifically minded people on the other. So the religiously minded people, that's going to roughly correspond to the tender-minded, and the scientifically minded will correspond to what James calls the tough-minded. This conflict between science and religion it actually is connected to a number of different philosophical problems that fall out of Descartes' work. As I tried to explain at the conclusion of a discussion of Descartes' philosophy, after Descartes, there are a number of different prominent modern philosophers who adamantly disagree with various points of Descartes' philosophy, but seem to accept many of his assumptions about the mind, and by extension, many of his assumptions about knowledge. And as I tried to explain, these assumptions lead to a set of problems that these philosophers share. They don't propose the same answers to these problems, but they share the same problems, right? And one of those problems is the problem of the relationship between mind and body, right? And another of these problems are the mind-body problem. And another problem is the problem of skepticism. So let me start out with a little bit of review, and then I'll try to, as plausibly as I can, connect this up to this cultural crisis, which I'm describing as a conflict between scientifically minded people on the one hand and religiously minded people on the other. So assumptions that philosophers after Descartes tended to share with Descartes have to do with the mind. They assumed with Descartes that self-awareness, so your awareness of your own mental states, right, your own mind, that it is and how it is, this is infallible. This is infallible. Okay, so knowledge of one's own mind, it's fundamentally different from knowledge of anything that is not one's own mind or a part of one's own mind, insofar as it is like absolutely certain. You can be sure of it, right? But whereas you cannot be like completely sure when it comes to beliefs about like anything else. Okay, what accounts for this difference, right? Why is it that you can be sure of or sure about your own mind and its contents, but not sure of anything else? Another assumption that these philosophers tend to make, an assumption that they shared with Descartes, is that our access to our own minds is different than our access to anything that is not, right, our own minds. Right? I should say, your access to your own mind is fundamentally different than your access to anything that isn't your own mind or a part of your own mind. Your access to your own mind is direct. It's immediate. It's not by way of anything else that you're aware of your own mind. What is it by way of which you're aware of your own mind? Your own mind. Well, whereas these philosophers shared with Descartes the view that if you're aware of anything other than your own mind, right, like this cup of coffee, for instance, right, it's actually indirect. It's by way of contents of your mind that are kind of like pictures. They represent things outside the mind, supposedly. We can call those like picture-like entities that are in the mind, ideas. Okay, so self-awareness is certain because it is immediate. It is direct. Awareness of anything else is uncertain because it is mediated. It is indirect. It is always by way of some third thing. So mind, cup, third thing, the idea of the cup that I have and that you, mug, that you now have too. Okay, so here's another assumption that was also shared among these philosophers concerning the mind. Mind has a peculiar feature. Besides this sort of infallible self-awareness, mind is also characterized by intentionality. And that's a funny word that philosophers use to talk about the purported fact that the mind and its states, like seeing, believing, thinking, supposing, hoping, wishing, the mind, its states are about other things. We could say, and it's bad English, but it may be helpful. We can say it, and nonetheless, mind and its states, they're characterized by aboutness. They're about some things, other things than themselves. They're directed towards those things. They in a way, speaking metaphorically, like aim at things. So right now I have a belief that there is a coffee mug, not quite full, but enough to get me through the lecture, behind me and to my right. Okay, that belief is characterized by intentionality insofar as the belief is about that mug. All right. So these views lead to, or they're at least connected to, the mind-body problem, and actually also the problem of skepticism. So let me deal with the mind-body problem first. These features that the mind is supposed to have, right? Indeed, features that the mind is supposed to obviously have, obvious, right? They do not seem to be physical features. And by physical features, I mean features that we talk about using the language of physics. So if you open up a physics textbook and flip through it and look at the terms that are used to talk about the physical world, right? You got mass, velocity, acceleration, right? Spatial dimensions, right? Temporal features, so features having to do with time. Okay, so shape, size, right? Motion. Look, at no point, when you're sort of looking through the book and listing off those feature terms, are you going to come across, right, anything that has anything to do with like self-awareness or aboutness. Okay, and so it does not seem as though, right, the mind can be a physical thing. If the mind has features, right, that are not physical features, right, not features to which we make reference when using the terminology of like the physics of Descartes' day, or even like the physics of our own day, right? This strongly suggests that the mind is something different than the body. Okay. Now, materialists, as you know, like reject this view, and they usually insist, right, that the mind just is the brain, and that these features, self-awareness, intentionality, they are then just like features of the brain. When pressed to name those features using the jargon of physics by dualists, materialists will usually say, well, we can't do that yet, but someday, right? Like as, for instance, neuroscience progresses, right, as we are better able to describe accurately the brain using ultimately the language of physics, right, we will end up being able to identify both of those features. Self-awareness, infallible, and intentionality, right, with some like particular physically described brain state or states. But we can't do it yet, right? Like the dualist response is typically to say, well, we not only think that you cannot do it yet, but just given how bizarre both these features are, we don't think that you'll ever be able to do it. Intentionality, for one thing, like is actually a very bizarre feature. After all, we can not only entertain thoughts of objects that actually do exist, such as the mug that is behind me and to my right, but we are also able to entertain thoughts, various kinds, about objects that don't exist and never did exist, right? Such as unicorns or Sasquatch. No offense to anyone who believes in Sasquatch, but Sasquatch is most unlikely. We can also entertain ideas of like not just objects that never existed, but also objects that are impossible objects, right? Like those spaces, right, that are depicted by, I think it's Escher, right? They're impossible spaces. Okay, we can think of those, right? So intentionality, it has to do with, again, it's aboutness, and it includes, right, being about things that not only don't exist, but could not possibly exist, right? How can that possibly be anything physical? Okay, how can that be the same as a particular brain state, right, or a set of brain states? So we have this problem. It remains a problem for philosophers, actually, to this day. We also have, falling out from these assumptions of Descartes, we have the problem of skepticism, not the completely destructive skepticism that Descartes seems to be left with at the end of Meditation 1, right, where he sort of, it's as though he's in despair, because it looks as though he has, through the course of that meditation, actually undermined the possibility that he could know anything. Okay, no. I mean, falling out from assumptions that Descartes makes and that his people following him shared is not that kind of radical skepticism. It's not the view that you can't know anything, right? It's just the view that you can't be certain of anything other than your own mind and your own mental states. That's it, right? That's all that you can be certain exists. right? After all, you're immediately aware of your own mind, right? That's what gives it, that's what gives you certainty about it. But you're only aware of anything other than your own mind and its contents by way of the contents of your own mind, okay? By way of your ideas, using Descartes' terminology, right? And so whenever you have an idea of something, right, like, again, this mug that's behind me and to my right, there's always the possibility that your idea does not match up with the thing, right? Maybe the thing has different features than what your idea represents it as having. Or maybe the thing doesn't exist at all, right? That's always a possibility. So you can't be sure, right, about anything outside your own mind, to use that metaphorical language, inside and outside when talking about the mind. But actually, it's worse than that. It's not just that you cannot be sure about anything outside your own mind. You can't. You're not even in a position to say, even under the best conditions, probably your ideas of how things are out in the world are accurate. You're not even in a position to say that, okay, I can't be certain, but probably when I have this idea that there's a cup behind me, right, there is actually a cup behind me. I mean, after all, probability claims, claims to the effect that something is likely, if they're justified, if they're supported by evidence, the evidence has to do with past observations of what, observations having to do with the frequency of some occurrence, right? Okay, what sort of observations would be relevant for supporting the claim that it's likely an idea matches up with how things really are outside your own mind? Well, you would have to have in the past observations of your ideas on those past occasions, on the one hand, and the things that they represented, supposedly, on the other. You would have to have been able to compare the two, right? And seen, somehow, that they match, right? Here's a case where I've got the idea on the one hand and it represents the object a certain way. I have the object on the other, right? And I compare the two and I see the idea as like a good representation of the object. And then you would see that again in another case and see that again in another case. And then you could conclude, in this case, the present case, when I look at that cup behind me and to my right and see that, sort of an off-white, feel that it's solid, right? See it has an opening at the top, right? Conclude, probably, there really is a cup there and it really does have those features. But here's the problem. If we accept Descartes' views about the mind, you're never in a position to compare your ideas of how things are with those things. After all, if we share Descartes' assumptions, we share the assumption that we're never directly aware of things outside our own minds. We're only indirectly aware of them by way of ideas. And so the best you can ever do when making comparisons with ideas and something else, with your ideas and something else, is to compare your ideas to your ideas. These assumptions then, they entail not a completely radical skepticism, not a skepticism about all knowledge, but still like a pretty radical skepticism. A skepticism to the effect that not only can you not be sure, right, about anything outside of your own mind, you're in principle never in a position to even say that any claims about objects outside your own mind are even likely true. Okay, and so you're really not in a position to justifiably assert anything concerning anything other than your own mind, and its contents. Okay, and that view, incidentally, led some philosophers in the 19th century and even the 20th century to adopt a position called solipsism, which is basically the position that I alone exist. It's just me and my ideas. That is the reality. After all, right? We should only think something is real if we have like good evidence for it, and the only good evidence that we have concerns our own minds, one's own mind, and its contents. And so, like the only justified account of what there is an account on which I alone exist, together with my ideas. Solipsism. Right now, it might seem as though these problems, mind-body problem, and this problem of a pretty radical skepticism, these are just academic problems in the pejorative sense. They have no importance for anybody outside of academic circles, and you might even say, going further down this road, that they don't even really matter except for people who are specialists within this weird field called philosophy. Okay. Strangely enough, though, in the course of the 19th century and on into the early 20th century, these ideas came to these problems and the various positions that philosophers took up in trying to solve them became involved in a broader cultural conflict. Okay, and that's the conflict that I have chosen to call this conflict between religiously minded people on the one hand and scientifically minded people on the other. Okay, this conflict really I think came to a head in the 19th century following the publication of Darwin's work. Okay, which actually occurred a long time after the work itself had, for the most part, been completed. I think he withheld publication for a while because he knew how much trouble it was going to cause. Darwin's work is, of course, immensely important for a number of reasons. Like here's one. It served to undermine rational justification for belief in the existence of God. Okay, and that's very important because appeal to that kind of justification was important for religiously minded people, right? Basically, after the dawn of modern science, right? If they had a rational justification for belief in the existence of God, that would allow them to kind of have it both ways, to both like believe in science, as we say these days, right? And believe in God too. It didn't seem to them as there was anything unscientific, let's put it that way, about belief in God, because they had a rational justification. The rational justification works like this. Let me give you a famous again as like a metaphor or an analogy to try and get clear on the reasoning here. I think this is an argument that was first given by William Paley. Suppose you're walking along a beach by the ocean, and you come upon some driftwood that's in a like sort of small stack. It doesn't form any particular like recognizable pattern, like the pattern of a letter or a number or anything like that, right? It's just a small stack of driftwood. Okay, could that have come about by chance, right? By just unintelligent, impersonal, physical processes? And the answer is, of course, yeah, sure. Wind, wave, that's going to be enough over time to account for that arrangement of sticks or logs even. Okay. Suppose, though, continuing to walk along this beach, you look down and you found, what you would call a pocket watch, right? Picked it up, old-fashioned ones. So you open the face. In there's the hour hand and the minute hand and a second hand too, and the appropriate numbers, right, arranged in a circle, and you wind it because there's a thing to do that with, and you set it, and it keeps time. It keeps time perfectly, right? So it's a functional pocket watch. And suppose you're curious about this thing. You're interested in how it's constructed. Right? And there's a way of opening it up, like to inspect it, to work on it, to repair it if necessary. And you do this, and you find it's composed out of many very small, intricately shaped parts, each of which has a particular function. It has a purpose that it can only perform in conjunction with other similarly crafted, it seems, parts. So that when all of these parts are doing their individual jobs, the whole object, the pocket watch, can do what seems pretty clearly to be its job, right? It can fulfill a function that it pretty clearly seems to just have, right? And that's to tell time. So impersonal physical processes, wind and rain and wave, they're enough, right? Given sufficient time to account for the stack of sticks, or the stack of, the pile of, I should say, logs. Could they account for the pocket watch? Right? Like, if you found this watch, would it ever occur to you, maybe this is like the sticks, maybe this just arose by chance, right? Accidents happen, and this is one of them. A functioning pocket watch, of course not, right? You would suppose instead, really the only possible explanation is that this thing was designed, right? After all, it exhibits purpose, it exhibits function, right? And not just in one part, but in many, right? Finely, seemingly crafted parts. Of course, this thing is not the product of chance. It is instead the product of intelligent design. Now, the argument continues. Look around you. What do you find? Well, you don't just find, right, stacks of rocks, piles of rocks, stacks of sticks, piles of driftwood. You find trees, and you find non-human animals, and you find humans too. And if you investigate those, right, and their parts, and it doesn't have to be a very thorough investigation, what you're going to find is exactly what you found in the case of a pocket watch, right? Many parts, each of which pretty clearly have particular functions that they can only fulfill in conjunction with other parts that also have other different functions, so that when you have all these parts functioning, the whole that they comprise, that whole is able to do certain things. It's able to fulfill certain functions, right? It's able to operate in certain ways. Okay. Clearly, then, plants, non-human animals, humans too, are products of intelligent design. An intelligent human designer? Well, of course not, right? Well, who then? God. And there you go. That's your rational justification for belief in God. It's called the design argument. And it allows you to have science and religion too, right? Scientists want the best explanation for the phenomena that they encounter, right? This is what people who believe in God are offering. And Darwin ruined all that. Because Darwin was basically able to show that, like, given enough time, right, chance could, in fact, impersonal physical processes, right, could in fact produce these objects which exhibit purposiveness, which have function, and indeed, I believe he also brought forth evidence having to do with living things, but also evidence having to do with the fossil record that gave a great deal of support to his claim that this is not the result of not necessarily the result of a divine intelligence, but instead the result of chance, impersonal physical processes. And so it looked to people like this is one of the reasons among many, but this is an important reason. It looked to people as though they had to choose, right? Religion, right, or science. Okay. To use James' terms, it looked as though people had to choose between what he calls like being tender-minded or being tough-minded. Okay, so he's got this idea that, right, in philosophy, people tend to adopt like sort of different positions based upon, speaking roughly, like what kind of person they are. Right, it's sort of different ideas appeal to different kinds of people. Right. And he uses these terms, tough-minded and tender-minded, to talk about these different kinds of people to whom like different sorts of ideas tend to appeal. Okay, so the people who are tough-minded, okay, he says among other things that they gravitate towards empiricism, and again we know from the part of the course on Descartes that. Empiricism is the view that like sensory experience, what I called empirical beliefs, they're the foundation of knowledge. Okay. Scientifically minded people, they tend to be empiricists in we could say epistemological orientation. Okay, when a claim is made, or when they make a claim. They want it to be supported, and they're looking for a particular kind of evidence and support. They're looking for like observational evidence. These days, they're looking for like experimental evidence. An experiment is just controlled observation, and observation, right? In detail, it means seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. Okay, so if someone's an empiricist, they're going to want knowledge claims backed up by sensory experiences. Okay. Tender-minded people, on the other hand, right? James says, tend to be more rationalistic. So again, we know from the part of the course dealing with Descartes that a rationalist is someone who will basically deny that empirical beliefs form the foundation of knowledge, and they will tend to say instead that certain like non-empirical principles lie at the foundation of knowledge. They will tend to argue that if we can learn anything from the senses at all, it's only on the basis of these principles that are not themselves derived from the senses or from sensory experience. And so one such principle in Descartes' philosophy is that a clear and distinct perception is veridical, right? It tells the truth. He doesn't support that principle by appeal to empirical beliefs. Instead, of course, like we know, like he supports that principle by appeal to a defective proof of God's existence. But be that as it may, right? That's an example of of a rationalist position. Religiously minded people tended to be more rationalistic, perhaps because observation doesn't look to support the claim that God exists. Okay, so if you're going to support it, you have to rely upon something else. Empiricists, tough-minded people who are empiricists, they also tend to advocate materialism. After all, what apparently is it that your senses hook you up with? What do they put you in touch with? Looks like always bodies in Descartes' sense, and apparently nothing else. Okay. Look, we should only claim that something is real if we have like evidence for it, right? And according to empiricists, the only kind of evidence you can have is like ultimately like sensory in nature. The only thing this kind of evidence can tell you about is body, matter, material things. Therefore, right, materialism is the correct metaphysical view. Right? Everything that exists is just body, and that would include the mind. Tender-minded people, on the other hand, they espouse various versions of what James calls idealism, right? Minimally, the idealist is committed to the view that no, right, not everything is just ultimately dumb, impersonal matter. No, if there is matter at all, it is created and controlled, right, by, or I should say created or controlled by that which is not matter, right? Mind, be it either, right, the human mind, right, or a divine mind, like the mind of God. People who are tender-minded, having this view that not everything is matter, also tended to believe in free will. Okay, and that's a view that human beings have free will that we first encountered in connection with Augustine's philosophy, and it was brought up by Augustine in order to solve like a theological problem, right? The problem or problems of evil. Okay, that view though that human beings have free will, that view was taken over by and endorsed by Descartes, and he held, as I think I tried to explain in the lectures on Descartes, he held that this free will, that's a power of the human mind, which is not a physical thing. And Descartes pretty much had to have that view of free will. He had to have the view that it was a feature of the mind, because it couldn't very well be a feature of body, right? After all, right, everything that happens in the physical world, so everything that happens having to do with bodies, that happens because it has to happen, given the laws of nature and what came before. Okay, everything that happens in the physical world is, in other words, causally necessitated by the past and the laws of nature. We could also say, in still other terminology, that everything that happens in the physical world is determined. It's determined. So material processes are deterministic processes. Okay, and so if you're going to be a believer in free will, you'd better not be a materialist. So tender-minded people, they're what James calls free willists. Not a very popular term these days. I think the more popular term is voluntarists. They're advocates of voluntarism, right? Which just means that there's free will. Materialists, on the other hand, and tough-minded people tend to be materialists. They're going to deny free will. They're going to be instead determinists. Okay. Finally, I should note that according to James, the tough-minded people tend to be a good deal more skeptical than tender-minded people. Tender-minded people, he says, tend to be more dogmatic. They tend to be much more willing to assert things without much in the way of evidence. Whereas tough-minded people, being empiricists, right? When a claim is made, they want to be shown, right? Ultimately, they want to be shown the observations that support making that claim. As a matter of fact, what observations support is much more limited than what many people think, and cannot support many of the claims that people, especially religiously minded people, are wont to make. And so people who are tough-minded, they end up being doubters, right? They doubt like a good deal more than the tender-minded people do. All right. And so I think you can see how, right, this cultural conflict that I've described in the terms, right, sort of religiously minded person versus scientifically minded person or people, is tied to those philosophical problems that emerge out of Descartes' work. Philosophers sort of got sort of drawn into this, you could call it like a culture war of the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay. James's view is that, and this is how he presents pragmatism to his audience in these lectures, we should be interested in pragmatism because it's going to allow us to effectively respond to this crisis. Okay, let's also before getting into how it's going to do this, let's give some thought though to like why it is that the crisis has not yet been resolved at the time when James is giving these lectures. Why didn't the tough-minded just win and the tender-minded just like go away? Well, James's view is that, as a matter of fact, look, there are tough-minded people and there are tender-minded people too, but the people who are like hardcore tender-minded, or the people who are like hardcore, like fanatical, tough-minded, they're a very, very small minority of the human beings that you actually encounter, right? I mean, the fanatics, they're loud, they're very loud, but they're a tiny number. Okay, most people, as a matter of fact, are neither one nor the other, right? They're sort of on many of these points, right? Like materialism, idealism, skepticism, dogmatism, rationalism, empiricism, free willism or voluntarism or determinism, right? They gravitate instead towards either something in the middle, or like one from tough-mindedness and one from tender-mindedness. Most people are of a temperament that they're not willing to go down either one of these extreme paths. You could put it this way, like in James's day, like many people, probably most people that he was talking to, they saw that there's a conflict here between science and religion, right? But they wanted their science and their religion too. Okay, but the thing is, they couldn't figure out a way to have both, right? There didn't seem to be any way of sort of charting a different course than either that the tough-minded want us to go down, or that the tender-minded want us to go down. Okay, and so there's a crisis because people like they feel unsatisfied with both these alternatives. Okay, but they don't see any other option besides those two, right? And also, as a matter of fact, like neither the tough-minded nor the tender-minded at that time were able to run the table and like decisively defeat the other in this cultural conflict. Okay, so we have this sort of persisting problem, and there doesn't seem to be any way solution to it, as far as most people are concerned. Okay, that's where pragmatism comes in, according to James. If you feel the force of this conflict and it concerns you, right? You are uncomfortable with being either tough-minded strictly or tender-minded strictly, right? Right. Well, then pragmatism is for you, right? It's going to allow you to see your way sort of past this cultural impasse, if that makes sense. Okay. So that's why you should be interested. Now, what is pragmatism? Okay. So James says that pragmatism is it's a method that's based upon a theory of meaning. Okay. So before getting into the method and theory of meaning, I just want to emphasize how different this is from the other philosophies that we've encountered thus far in this course. Okay. Those other philosophies, I mean, they're for the most part like theories. They're not methods for solving problems or addressing problems. Okay, they're not methods for resolving or dissolving disputes between people. They're sometimes elaborate statements. These philosophies that we've encountered so far, before pragmatism, they're elaborate statements of like the way things are. Okay, here, for instance, Plato says, is what a just society always looks like everywhere and at all times, right? Here's the pattern, okay? Here, Plato, Augustine, Descartes say, is the fundamental nature of reality, period, right? I worked it all out for you. It's the forms, it's the great chain of being, it's dualistic interactionism. Pragmatism is not that kind of philosophy. Pragmatism is like it's kind of like a way of doing things, intellectually. Okay, it's a way of handling problems. All right. If you handle problems in the pragmatist way, that a certain theory may fall out of that. Right, that might be the conclusion that you come to regarding the problem in question. But pragmatism as such, right, is for the most part not committed to any substantive theories at all. Okay, substantive theories about like how things are. Right. James gives a brilliant illustration of this method in Lecture 2. And it's an illustration that shows you how the method is tied to the pragmatist theory of meaning. So I want to go through the example first that he gives, and then get into the theory of meaning that the method employed in the example is based upon. And then conclude this lecture by going through a couple of other examples of employing this method based upon that theory of meaning to address problems. So, I don't know if James went on a lot of hikes. From my understanding, like he was a diminutive man who was always in bad health. So I kind of doubt it. But he does claim, I think in the second lecture, to have gone on a long hike with a bunch of other people one day hike, and he couldn't keep up. And like everybody else, kind of like they weren't very nice. I guess they left him behind, and he fell so far behind that they stopped to wait for him for a long time. Right, probably took a break to eat, like have a little picnic, And apparently, like while they were stopped and eating, they noticed a squirrel and on a tree. And someone probably tried to get like a better look at the squirrel and couldn't, because as they move basically like to the right to kind of get a better look at the squirrel just like on the other side of the tree, right, would also move to its right. I mean, that's if you've had virtually any experience of squirrels, like you know what I'm talking about. I mean, the squirrel on a tree is always going to try to keep the tree between it and you, right? So they got into this debate, the other members of the hiking party. Well, suppose someone, let's say a man, kept doing this, right? So there's a squirrel on a tree, and you can imagine the squirrel being like, it's on the other side of the tree, and maybe it's sort of like looking at the man, right? He's like poking his head out from behind the tree, right? And like the man, let's say, like moves to his right to try and like get a better look at the squirrel, to like get behind the squirrel and like see the whole squirrel. Right? Well, the squirrel will just then like move further to its right, and like they sort of do the same thing, like the way they do, right? And the man goes further to his right. Well, the squirrel then is going to like scurry to like its right. Suppose the man keeps doing this and the squirrel keeps doing this too. So that the man eventually, he circumnavigates, or would it be circumambulate? I don't know. He walks a complete circle, right? So that he ends up back in the very position from which he started, before he started to move to his right. Okay, right. And the squirrel is, of course, like, back to its original position too. And it's sort of like that. Okay, so here was the debate. Has the man gone around the squirrel? Apparently there were an odd number of people in the hiking party altogether, including James. And so the people who had left him behind, everyone but James, half of them said yes, the man had gone around the squirrel, and half of them said no. And so when James arrives, everyone wants him to break the tie, right? So which is it? William James, great philosopher and psychologist, are the people who say that he went around the squirrel right, or are the people who deny this correct? And James proceeded to make everyone mad, which is probably not what pragmatists are supposed to do, but I'm sure he made everyone mad, because he said he refused to break the tie. He said, "You're both right." After all, the problem is, right, does the man go around the squirrel or not? Consider the terms, consider the words in which the problem is couched, the words in which we express the problem, especially the word around. What does it mean to go around? If the word around applies to a situation where things are moving, right, how do you expect experience to go? What do you expect to observe if the word applies? Well, one thing the word around can mean is this. The man in this situation goes to the right of the squirrel, behind the squirrel, to the left of the squirrel relative to his starting position, to back in front of the squirrel. So that's one thing we mean by going round, right? You can observe the thing to go from front to right, behind, left, back to front. That's one meaning of around. Does the man go around in this sense? No. And so the people who said no, it doesn't go around, they're right. The man doesn't go around the squirrel for the simple reason that the man never gets behind the squirrel. Try as you might, you can never get behind the squirrel, right? That's just the way they are, right? Can't get behind the squirrel. But there's something else we might mean by around. We also might mean by around passing to the north of to the west of, to the south of, to the east of, right? That's also what we might mean by around, okay? Does the man go around the squirrel in that sense? Yes, he does. And so you are both correct. Okay. So notice something that we've done here, like besides just giving an analysis of meaning of a term to address a problem. More on that in a second, but notice something else here. What we've actually shown is that this problem is it's a fake problem. It's a fake problem because the dispute here is not a substantive dispute. The parties to the dispute are not genuinely disagreeing about how the world is. Okay. They are instead talking about the very same state of affairs in two different ways, right? This is a verbal dispute. It's a verbal dispute, okay, as opposed to a substantive dispute. And a verbal dispute is going to happen when people either do one of two things. Either the disputing parties are using the same term in two different ways, and that's what's going on with the squirrel problem. Or they're using two different terms in the same way. In both cases, parties to the dispute think it's a substantive dispute. They're really arguing about like how the world is, and one is saying it's this way, and the other was saying no, it can't be that way. It has to be this other way, right? When really, right, it's a verbal dispute. They're either using the same term in two different ways, and so it could be the case that what they're both saying is true, and there's no conflict here. There's no conflict, or right, they're using two different words in the same way, and so again, there's actually no conflict. There's actually no conflict. Okay, that's one of the things that pragmatism as a method is actually going to allow us to do, according to James. It will reveal that some problems that we have are actually fake problems because the dispute is not a substantive dispute. The parties aren't really at odds to the dispute. They aren't really at odds about how the world is. They're just talking about it in different ways, either using the same terms differently with different meanings, right? Or different terms in the same way, so with the same meaning. So that then brings me to the pragmatist theory of meaning. So again, this method is based upon a way of getting clear on the meanings of the terms in which problems are couched, or we could also say problems are expressed. So, as James notes, he is not the originator of the pragmatist theory of meaning. Credit for that goes back to a fellow that I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, and that's Charles Sanders Peirce. And specifically, I think Peirce, he first expressed this doctrine in a published work in an essay called "How to Make Our Ideas Clear," right? Appropriately enough. And it was there that Peirce held that basically the meaning of an idea, or better, like the meaning of a word, is the practical difference that it makes, right? Or another way of putting it, the meaning of a word is the practical consequences that it has. Practical consequences that it has. Okay. So what is he talking about, and why in these two formulations is he using the word practical? Okay. Brief digression before getting into like a detailed explanation and an example. Another example of using the pragmatist method. Pragmatism is actually a word that is based upon a Greek word, and the Greek word is a word for action. And so pragmatism, you could understand it as like actionism. This is a philosophy that lays a great deal of stress on action. Okay, how does the pragmatist theory of meaning, in particular, stress action. The meaning of an idea or a word. I prefer to talk about words rather than ideas. The meaning of a word is the difference in how your experience would go as you act in the world if the word applied. Okay? The meaning of a word, right? That's the same as the consequences you could expect to observe as you act in the world, as you do things in the world, if the idea applies. Okay. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get clear on meanings of words, right? By thinking about like what difference, right, it makes to our experience as we act if the word applies. Okay. So we've looked at one example of using this method that depends upon this theory of meaning, James's first great example having to do with the man and the squirrel. Okay, now I'm going to give another example to try to make this way of doing things in philosophy more clear. And this example has to do with the idea of wine, or the meaning of the word wine. Okay, and this other philosopher, this other pragmatist, with whom James was friends for a time, Charles Sanders Peirce, he actually brings up this example himself and provides the analysis himself in that article, how to make our ideas clear. He actually brings up this example in connection with a dispute or actually among religiously minded people, Catholics and Protestants. Protestants, apparently, I trust this is true, they believe that like the wine that's part of religious ceremonies in a Christian church, the wine is just like a symbol for Jesus, right? It's not literally the blood of Christ. whereas Catholics of the time of like still like mid-19th century, according to Peirce, right? They held, oh no, right? Like after certain rituals have been performed, like it may look like wine and taste like wine, not very good wine, but like still like tastes like wine, and smell like wine and so forth. But that it's no longer wine. It's actually been turned into the blood of Christ. Okay, and so he's like, okay, so how can we apply the pragmatism method to address this problem, the problem of like who's right, the Protestants or the Catholics? How can we use pragmatism to address this dispute? Okay. So the first thing we do as pragmatists is we try to get clear on the ideas, the words involved in the dispute, particularly like wine. Okay, and to get clear on the meaning of the word wine, we need to get clear on how we expect our experience to go as we act in the world if the word wine actually genuinely applies to something. Okay, like this. Now, this is not wine, not even white wine. It's like way too early in the day. As far as I'm concerned, like for even white wine, it's just water. Trust me, but I'm going to use it as a prop anyway, because I think it helps make the point. Look, if the word wine applies to that, and I spill it, and I knock the glass over, okay, I knock the glass over. How would I expect my experience to go? Well, if I tip the glass over, right, I will see the liquid spill out. Okay, were I to tip it over or even turn it upside down, and this stuff were to stay inside the glass, and indeed like stay like right where it is now, not even moving, okay, whatever that is, that's not wine. All right, it's not a beverage at all. I don't know what it is. Okay, let's say instead of this looking perfectly clear like water, let's say, or It were red and only somewhat opaque, so somewhat translucent. Okay, and I had like a white linen tablecloth. I tipped it over. Right. If it's wine, if it's really red wine, how would I expect my experience to go? Well, it would not only spill out, but it would also stain the cloth, right? If instead of staining the cloth, it immediately like turns into smoke and like floats away, right? The stuff that I spilled out, yeah, whatever that is, like that ain't wine. It's probably best you not drink it. Okay. Again, I mean, this is just water. It smells like nothing. But suppose it were like red wine, right? And I were to do that, okay? How would I expect my experience to go? I would expect to be able to detect at least the very slight scent of grape, as opposed to bacon, right? If I did this, I was like, bacon. I mean, honestly, I like bacon, so I might enjoy that. But I mean, I would not say that this was wine. I mean, whatever this is, right? This is not wine. Okay. So you see what we're doing here. We're analyzing the meaning of the word wine, or the meaning of the idea wine, to talk like Peirce, into a set of statements, each of which says what we're going to sense when we act on the object that supposedly is wine in a certain way, right? If you tip it over, it will spill out. If it spills onto white cloth, it will stain it. If you smell it, right, you will detect, faintly at least, the scent of grape, and so on. Okay. Back to coffee. Oh, so how does this help us address this problem that the Catholics and the Protestants seem to be having, where they're arguing about whether or not like this is like just wine, or whether it's like really like the blood of Christ? Well, Peirce wants to ask the Catholics, and he sort of does ask the Catholics in this article, like, so, right, the stuff that you're saying is not wine. If you spill it, I mean, if you tip over a glass of it, what's going to happen? I mean, it's going to spill, right? And if you were to tip it onto like white linen, like it would stain it, right? And if you smell it, you get a slight scent of grape. Oh, and most importantly, this is another part of the meaning of wine that I neglected to mention earlier. If you drink copious quantities of it in a short period of time, like you're going to get very, very drunk, right? Like versus like I could go on like listing, right? Basically what you can expect of an object if the word wine applies to it when you act on it. At any point, are you going to say, with regard to, right, what you're calling blood of Christ, at any point are you going to say, no, that doesn't happen? In other words, right, does what you're calling blood of Christ, does it in a sense like behave any differently, right, than what we call wine? Is there any like practical difference it makes, right, for something to be the blood of Christ instead of just wine? Okay. And Peirce thought, I mean, the answer either has to be yes or no. If the answer is no, right? If there's no practical consequence of something that being the blood of Christ that's any different than the practical consequence of wine, then you're just using the words blood of Christ to say wine, right? You're saying exactly the same thing, okay? And so there's no dispute here. This is another case of verbal dispute. This is another case of people like not really being in any kind of substantive disagreement, right? It's instead people using two different words with the very same sense. Okay, so if there's no practical difference, right, blood of Christ makes that's any different from the practical difference that wine makes, if they make the same practical difference, right, These are the same ideas. These words have the exact same meaning. Right? Let's say though that the Catholic says, oh, you know what, that there is some practical difference it makes. That's different than the practical difference that the idea of wine makes. Person would want to know, well, what? Right? Suppose the Catholic says, I can't say. It just does. It just does. Okay. In that case, we're going to be forced to conclude that this blood of Christ idea, this blood of Christ phrase, those words, they're absurd. Like they're meaningless, because like Peirce's view is, and James's view is this too. If you cannot point to a practical difference, right, that an idea makes, or that like a word makes, okay, then there's no genuine idea here. The word is senseless. It's a meaningless word. Okay, and so this gives us like yet another way in which pragmatists can address problems, can sort of end disputes, right? So we analyze the meaning of the terms involved in the problem, involved in the dispute. Sometimes that'll show us the dispute is merely a verbal one. There's no substantive disagreement here. The parties to the dispute are using the same term in two different ways, or they're using different terms in exactly the same way. So there's no genuine disagreement. Another possibility, though, is that the dispute is based upon like nonsense. The dispute involves like an absurdity. Okay, and if we can show using the pragmatism method that one party to the dispute is engaged in uttering absurdities and the other is not, the other just refuses to talk that way. Okay, well, it's pretty clear who's right. Right? Well, or I should put it this way. It's pretty clear whose view we need not consider any longer. Right? I mean, the Protestants could still be wrong. Maybe if we observe what's called wine in a church more closely, it'll prove to defeat our expectations concerning wine. But at least at this point we can safely say, yeah, that Catholic view, that makes no sense at all. It's just an absurd view, and so we can rule that out. Okay. Another upshot of the pragmatist method is that sometimes we'll find that literally one of the parties in a dispute has an absurd position, and so we can just not consider it anymore. We can just rule it out. Okay. So I think you can see already why pragmatism might be intellectually useful. Right? There are lots of intellectual problems. There are lots of disputes. Okay, it would be nice if we had a way of focusing on the ones that are worthwhile instead of the ones that are wastes of time. It'd be good if we could focus on the substantive disputes. Okay, disputes where people are genuinely at odds about how the world is. Okay, instead of verbal disputes, and it would certainly be better to focus on disputes where all the positions regarding the problem make sense. Right, as opposed to disputes where some of the positions or a lot of the positions or even all the positions are just nonsense positions, and so not worth our time and effort at all. Okay, and that's what pragmatism allows us to do. Okay, but one last example, it also helps us deal with substantive problems too, right? Substantive disputes too. My last example is going to illustrate this. So James wants to say that while pragmatism is a mid to late 19th century philosophy emerging in the United States at first, he wants to say that people in the sciences have very often, in the past, even before there was an official pragmatist movement, right, sort of operated like pragmatists. they sort of approach problems in the way that pragmatists recommend approaching problems. And let me give an example of this, what James is talking about here, having to do with like the history of science, especially the history of chemistry. I believe that a man named Lavoisier, who I think is a French Civil War era figure, I believe that he is largely credited with founding the scientific discipline of chemistry. And the founding of chemistry as a scientific discipline is very much, it's my understanding, bound up with a particular problem that people, many of whom would have been alchemists, some of whom were sort of proto-chemists like Lavoisier, were grappling with. And the problem was combustion. Like how do we explain burning? How do we explain flame? What's going on there? Now some people, having like observed, for instance, like logs burning in a fireplace, they held that combustion involves a substance that they called phlogiston, or it may be pronounced phlogiston, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to say phlogiston. Phlogiston was supposed to be a substance that was emitted. It was lost, right? During the process of burning, during the process of combustion. So it kind of, burning amounted to phlogiston for some reason being released, like flowing out. And this actually makes a good deal of sense if you observe like a fire in a fireplace, right? Not actually that one behind me, because that's a fake fire, but like a real fire, right? If you observe it can kind of look at a certain point like flame is flowing out of the wood, sort of pouring out of the wood, almost like a lighter than air liquid. Okay, so phlogiston. That was one hypothesis concerning combustion. Lavoisier had a different, this founder of chemistry, he had a different hypothesis, if I understand correctly, and that's that now combustion involves a hitherto unrecognized, like unknown element, sort of basic constituent of the material world, oxygen. And combustion does not involve the release of oxygen. No, combustion actually involves the addition of oxygen, right? Combustion involves somehow this invisible element in the air combining with that which is burning. Okay, so Lavoisier's idea is that combustion involves addition of something. These other people, their idea is that combustion involves like the loss of something. Okay, so there's the phlogiston hypothesis, loss. There's the oxygen hypothesis, addition. Okay, look, these are both meaningful ideas. Okay. They both of these ideas, both these words, phlogiston, oxygen, they have practical consequences, and they have different practical consequences. And this is the important point. Okay, what would you expect if the word phlogiston applies? What would you expect to find if you weighed the burned material, all of it, right? Ashes and smoke somehow, before and then after combustion? What would you expect to find? Phlogiston, remember, that which is released during combustion, supposedly, right? Phlogiston involves loss. How would you expect your experience to go if you weighed the burned material before it burns and then after it burns? Phlogiston is what is released. Well, the remnants are going to weigh less. That's a practical difference that phlogiston, the word, the idea, makes. Okay. How, by contrast, would you expect your experience to go if the oxygen hypothesis is true? Right? And so combustion is the addition of this invisible, hitherto unrecognized, unknown element. Right? How would you expect it to go if you weighed the burning stuff, or the stuff to be burned, before it burns and then after it burns? The oxygen hypothesis entails that combustion is addition of an element. Okay. Well, you would expect, right? If there's a physical process of adding stuff, that's combustion. You would expect the smoke and ashes to weigh more than the object before it burned. Again, in the phlogiston case, you would expect the smoke and ashes to weigh less, right, after combustion than before combustion. Okay, the object as a whole before combustion, because phlogiston involves release and oxygen involves addition. Okay, this is a substantive dispute. This is not a verbal dispute. Neither party is uttering an absurdity. As ridiculous as the word phlogiston now sounds, it's still it's a perfectly sensible thing to say about how the world is, phlogiston. Okay. How can pragmatism help us resolve this dispute? Pragmatism helps us identify how these two hypotheses, how these two ideas about how the world is, are different. It helps us identify different things we should expect to find when we act in certain ways. Okay, and so pragmatism points the way to a decisive test of these ideas, a test that will establish which of them is true and which of them, though sensible, is false. Okay? Basically, pragmatism points the way to an experiment that will allow us to decide the issue once and for all. An experiment is, after all, just a controlled observation. Okay? And that's actually what happened. I don't know the details of how the experiment was conducted, but somehow, I think Lavoisier managed not just to weigh the material to be burned before it was burned, but also to weigh after combustion the ashes, if it was wood that was burned, and he somehow also captured all the smoke particles, all that, weighed them too, and sure enough, all together, the smoke and ashes weighed more than the object, right? That was burned. Okay, and so the oxygen hypothesis proved true, and the phlogiston hypothesis proved false. Right? That's pragmatism. It's a method for addressing problems that very often take the form of disputes between people. That's based upon a theory of meaning, right? And when we use pragmatism, sometimes we just dismiss the problem as a sort of a fake problem, a pseudo problem. In other words, it's a fake problem. On the grounds that the dispute is merely verbal, or that one party or more are speaking absurdities. Or, right, we identify some actual practical differences that the ideas involved make, okay, that the words involved make, right, and thereby we point the way to a test, an experiment, right, by which we can actually put the dispute to bed, right? We can resolve it on the basis of evidence. So that's pragmatism. What does this have to do with that cultural conflict I was talking about before, and those problems in philosophy stemming from Descartes' work that cultural conflict is tied to? Well, I'll get into that more next time when I talk about Chapter 3, the third lecture from James's Pragmatism, about what he calls metaphysical disputes. James, the word metaphysics and metaphysical, that word too, they're used in a number of slightly different ways by philosophers, which is like unfortunate and kind of annoying. I mean, basically, philosophers use the word as I've said the word is used, and that's to talk about fundamental nature of reality, right? Theories about that are metaphysical theories, right? So theory of forms, great chain of being, dualistic interactionism. Those are all metaphysical theories. James wants to talk about metaphysics, though, not just as like theories about the fundamental nature of reality, but he wants to talk about metaphysical disputes as disputes about the fundamental nature of reality that don't seem to be resolvable by scientific method, by science. So we can't just appeal to science, right, in order to figure out if human beings have free will or not. We can't appeal to like just science to figure out if idealism is true in James's sense, or materialism is true. Okay, so lecture 3, he's going to try and use pragmatism to address those points of conflict, right, between religiously minded people and scientifically minded people, between the tender-minded and the tough-minded. And also next time, I'll get into surely the most famous and controversial aspect of pragmatist philosophy, and that's the pragmatist theory of truth as articulated by James. I believe that's the subject matter of the 6th lecture on pragmatism. And I will just conclude then this lecture with a couple of hints about how that theory is going to go, that theory of truth that James offers. His theory of truth is going to amount to an analysis of what we mean when we say true. Okay, so to get at what James thinks, to get at what James's theory of truth is, consider what practical difference does it make when some claim is a true one, right? What are the practical consequences of an idea being true, or a word truly applying to something? Okay, that's going to be what true means. Okay, here's another hint. Words, ideas, right? They are for pragmatists sort of like tools. That the word wine, for instance, that's kind of like a predictor tool, right? If someone tells you something is wine, what they're telling you is how you can expect your experience to go when you act on the object in certain ways, like drink lots of it in a short period of time. they're among other things. I suppose they're warning you or they're enticing you. I don't know. So words, ideas, they're tools. Okay. True then, right? Is also going to be like a tool. Okay. When we say that an idea is true, aren't we saying something good about it? Right? Like a true idea is a good idea. I mean, ordinarily, you can come up with exceptions, but like ordinarily, right? True is a good-making quality in an idea, or is a good-making quality in a word, right? Okay. Well, if ideas and words are basically tools, right? Like what makes a tool good? Because that's kind of what we're saying when we say that like an idea or a word or a set of words is true. We're saying like, oh, those are some good tools. Okay. What makes a tool good? Right. Well, I think the answer is in a word, usefulness. Usefulness. Okay. And so that should give you a pretty good indication of what James's theory of truth is going to be. Right. Words being true, ideas being true, that's a matter of them being useful in a certain way. That's the practical difference that an idea being true or a word or set of words being true makes. And that is all for this time.